Manager for the Language Access Project here with United Way. So today's workshop number 6, as we mentioned previously, it is open for the public, not only for the sub-awardees. It's going to be about strategies for effective language access, and I will let David start the presentation. Go ahead, David, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Bill. Good morning, everyone. Okay, so we are here today to discuss something critical for our community service, which is language access. Our goal is to bridge the communication gap that often exists between service providers and those who don't speak English as their primary language. This is just not about compliance, but about making sure that everybody feels welcome, included, and most important, understood. So in this presentation, I want to explore a little review on demographics, why we do this. It's going to be very fast going on the demographics, and I'll explain why. And give you some tips about multicultural outreach and some of the key points for you guys to implement language access. So when we talk about demographics, we usually look at race, ethnicity. Nevada, it's already considered since 2021 majority minority state. What that means is that it's not just white, but Hispanics are about 30%, and then we have other cultures or other communities that are coming in. Another thing that we have to keep in mind is that, like I've always said, it's not about the numbers of residents, but also the numbers of immigrants, the numbers of visitors. We have tourists that come in, about 3 million tourists a month. So those are numbers that usually we don't get to see in our statistics demographics. There has been an increase over the years from 2010. Every 5 years, we see an exponential increase in the community. As you guys know, with COVID, a lot of people were working from home. So we started getting other people migrating from other states to Nevada, perhaps because cost of living is lower than California. And that also is something to have in consideration when it comes to your statistics. Also, the numbers don't lie. Definitely, there is many of our neighbors that face significant barriers when interacting with essential services. And today we're going to talk about how to address some of these barriers. So when we talk about languages, based on the statistics that we can pull out on the internet, English, 72%, almost 73%, then Spanish, 20% of the community. Then we have, usually it goes into Asian languages, but when we break it down, then we have Tagalog, Chinese, Korean, Vietnamese, Japanese. Now, when we talk about demographics, it's not just about what we find in the internet, but what we can find in our own organization. So when I was in the hospital setting, the demographics, even though for the community were laid out like this, some of the statistics were skewed based on the amount of providers that we had that were bilingual. What I mean by that is that Tagalog, for example, the U.S. has some sort of contract with the Philippines where we usually get nurses, medical providers coming in to practice here in Nevada. And we have a big pool of nurses that speak Tagalog. And so when we looked at statistics created by our language services vendor, whether it's over the phone, video services, the statistics were not really matching with the demographics or what we needed to start translating into the documents, just because a lot of the nurses were not using the interpreters, so that was not going into the statistics provided into the language services portion. So that's something to keep in mind, that when you are providing a service, and not always line up your thoughts on getting the statistics from one point, which would be your language vendor, but also look at other areas such as admission or filling out the forms or people that come into your website. There is some sort of feature in your website that you can create some sort of translation services, or people that start inquiring. If you put in the language of preference in the forms or surveys, then you might get a better a better understanding of the type of community that you're exactly dealing with, especially when it comes to languages and demographics. So when we talked about language and the importance on the business part of it for our organizations, it is about making sure that everybody is included, understood, that the services are provided in a way that there is no discrimination. And when we talked about some of the federal guidelines or laws, rules, and regulations, we talked about Title VI, we should not discriminate anybody because of sex, national origin, race, ethnicity. So the national origin portion of it is the language access, the language services. And a lot of the times, this goes into the training part of the staff, which is making sure that the clients know that we provide the service of language access. If we need an interpreter or somebody that is bilingual, we might have it on staff. We might get the telephone and connect with them. And avoid questions like, make sure that you bring somebody with you that speaks English. So that has been an issue created over the years. The Department of Justice has fined multiple agencies that have done that in the past, just because one of the main reasons is that you're implying, by telling somebody to bring somebody that speaks English, is that if they cannot get anybody that speaks English and their language, then they might not get the service that you guys are providing. So it is better to provide the service, and I'll expand a little more on that when we talk about policies and procedures. Just because there are some technicalities that you want to make sure that you keep your organization safe and also welcoming to everybody. So prioritizing languages, as we saw in the statistics, 30% Spanish speakers, that's something to keep in mind. We have a lot of people that speak Spanish that are born and raised here in the United States. We have services over the phone. A lot of the time when you hire somebody that is bilingual, Spanish might be one of the languages. So it is important that HR purposes, that you create some sort of guideline on when hiring somebody that is bilingual, like, what am I doing as an organization to make sure that the person is bilingual? So if a requirement would be to provide some sort of certificate of language proficiency, that could be available as an organization. You could contract with a language service provider, or not for interpreting services, but for language education. UNLV sometimes provide the services, or gives you the opportunity to or the resources to connect with an agency that provides testing. So that way there is some sort of documentation. For the most part, what we have done in the past is, if you speak two languages and you want to be considered bilingual for the organization, then there's got to be some sort of proof for me that you are bilingual. So I speak Spanish. I have taught Spanish. I have a very good knowledge of what questions I can ask and have a conversation with you in Spanish and decide whether you're really proficient in Spanish or not. And based on that proficiency assessment, I can say, yes, this person speaks Spanish, and that gets archived, it gets in your records, proof that you speak Spanish. A lot of the times when the companies just decide that the person speaks English based on the application that they submit, the interview process, and the education in the resume. Part of the other languages that are non-English could be high school diploma or above, or certain amount of credits, units in college. So if I went to college, but I speak French, but if I definitely can show that I had like 16 credit units, then that could be some sort of proficiency level there. So that's something to keep in mind when it comes to using somebody that is bilingual. A lot of the times we have organizations that say, hey, we have somebody that is bilingual, born and raised in Mexico, but we don't have proof they went to high school here or college here, but we don't have proof or any documentation. So in that case, the organization can create their own guidelines on how they're going to assess the individual to make sure that there's proficiency, or refer them to this type of resources where they do the testing themselves and they provide you a level of proficiency. Sometimes it's 1 through 5 or letters, where it says the person is bilingual, native, or professional proficiency. And based on that, there will be some limitations. Now, as I'm talking, if you have any questions, please go ahead and type them in the chat box so we can address them at the end in our Q&A session. So that way we're not waiting for the last minute to try to think of some sort of questions. So don't feel free to go ahead and type those. So those are some of the language limitations. Make sure that you provide the some sort of service. When we provide language services, like I've said in the past, make sure that your organization has some sort of vendor for language access, telephone services, video services. A lot of the time, you may not be using this, you're not being charged for having the 1-800 number or the access to this agency. And if your organization already has this type of services in place, then it is very important that everybody knows how to use it. Because a lot of the times it gets implemented, everything is perfect, dual set telephones are in place, or cordless phones that you can put on speaker and have a nice talk with an interpreter on the phone from that agency. But if only one person has had the in-service and knows how to what the 1-800 number is, what the codes are for the languages, and that person is out on vacation or called in sick, the system just goes down. So make sure that part of the orientation process is knowing how to activate this type of services on how to use the telephone or how to use your language access resources. And I want to give you some key implementation points. So when we talk about demographics, cultural considerations, outreach strategies and community partnerships, especially, we've had some experiences. And so let's go with multilingual outreach. So creating materials in multiple languages. I know that sometimes could be time consuming or not cost effective for if you don't have the budget. So the idea is to translate essential documents and materials into the languages spoken by the community members. These include brochures, flyers, the website, signs throughout your organization if it's an organization that welcomes tourists. The idea to ensure that all materials are culturally sensitive and appropriate for the target language. Now, we talked about the limitations of demographics. We know what the demographics are in the community, but when you guys are a niche for a specific culture, and I'm gonna just call out one of the organizations that we've been working with, for example, the Asian community, ACDC. We have, so they, just in the name, Asian is in the name, ACDC. So they're going to attract the specific target community. So the demographics that we provide on the city, on the state, or the actual where the organization is placed might not be the of the different type of languages that they're experiencing. So if we have I'm getting a sign here that I might have some connectivity issues. I hope everybody can hear me just fine. So if, so for example, ACDC have language services, Spanish might not be the majority as it is for some of the hospitals in town. So then we have to break it down if it's Vietnamese, Korean, Chinese, and which type of Chinese, Mandarin, Cantonese, and then just looked at the average, the percentage of clients, patients, customers that are coming in for those languages. Now, it is also important to look at the when we talk about translating materials versus interpreting or having somebody to help with the communication. So just remember those two words. Interpretation means verbal, translation means written. So bilingual staff, great. We have these people in the front desk, nurses, doctors, they speak these languages, and they will provide interpretation services. Or we don't have anybody, but we provide video over the phone services. In that case, my vendor for language access, remote services, is going to give me the statistics on the calls, when they happen, what time they happen, and type of language, amount of minutes. One of the things that I've talked to some of the organizations is, based on that statistic, if, for example, go back to ACDC, for example, if they're getting Mandarin, Cantonese, and Vietnamese and Tagalog as their big languages that they use all the time for the telephone services, and then Korean, they only get like one call a week. But when we looked at the amount of minutes, the average of minutes of the other languages is like 15, 20, 30 minutes. But when we looked at Korean, even though it's once a week, it's 2 hours, 3 hours at a time, then that's something that we need to look at specifically, like what's going on. And a lot of the times when that happens could be that the written materials are not in place. For example, we might have consent forms translated into a bilingual format, English and this other language. But if we don't have it into in the example of the Korean, then the reason that the language is taking 2 hours or 3 times, 5 times compared to the other ones is because with the interpreter over the phone, we're going over consent forms, over written documents. So it's more time consuming since we don't have that in place. So that's when we have to think, do we need this to reduce the time of the interpreter cost? Do we need to have this translated? And that might be the cost benefit on making that decision.
Hey, David, sorry to
Yes.
interrupt, but we do have a few people in the waiting room. If you can please let them in.
Oh. Okay. So that's something to consider based on your amount of customers or amount of statistics that you're getting through your organization. Now, I get this question a lot. What languages do I need to have translated, or what materials? Usually what we say is that the most important materials, like if you have forms, consent forms, or something that is vital, something that it's very needed. I mentioned brochures, flyers, the website.
And otherwise, our plan is out of the network rate, so it's 60%. So, and your deductible that you missed, okay.
I got somebody with the microphone on. I think that.
I think you can mute her, David, if she did it by accident. You can just click on the three dots there as a host.
Sorry, not seeing the option. Yeah, I'll just continue. So there is a rule that was many years ago implemented that was if these specific languages surpasses 5%, then we should have this language available for in translation. Start translating the documents. Some organizations say, oh, let's do 15%. But what we need to look at is, are we talking about the percentage of the community residents or the percentage on the customers that we're getting? And I think it will be more beneficial based on the statistics that we're producing on the community that we're serving. And so that's where those numbers come in handy. Just trying to go more in depth on what we're serving, figure out ways to analyze the languages that we need, that we're serving, so we can have some of these specific documents or website translated into their language. Now, community partnership, collaborating with local organizations that serve the community members that are trying to do outreach. Organizations can provide valuable insights and connections to the community. It's better to work together to develop programs and services to meet the specific needs to the community. And I think United Way is doing an excellent job bringing different type of organizations that serve different communities. So United Way would be a great resource on this type of, like, oh, do you know an organization that can provide this type of language? So they might have that information for you. Now, policies, procedures. This is where it comes a little sticky and complicated. HR perspective, we usually create policies, procedures, because we want to avoid issues that has happened in the past. So, for example, if we have a dress code policy, it's because somebody showed up not looking professional and that didn't create a nice image for the organization. So we're going to start modifying this policy, perhaps blue jean Fridays, but that's it, and make sure the blue jeans doesn't have any, they're not ripped. Same thing with language access. We need to create some sort of policy and procedure to avoid issues that has happened to our organization or that has happened in our own organization. A lot of the times when we talk about policies and procedures, there are different layers. So we have to create comprehensive and easy to understand policies that align companies' stance on privacy, data protection, other related matters. Ensure that these policies are aligned with relevant laws and regulations.
Since you're not like technically tasked yet, you can just text them and just say, hey, I just need your expiration.
Make sure your microphone is muted. And part of the policies should include that you have some sort of vendor services provided. For example, the how to use the 1-800 number, how to use the services. If you guys have virtual interpreters, video remote interpreters, tablets assignated to video for sign language and spoken languages, then those tablets, there might be some policy fine print on how to charge those tablets, who's in charge of the tablets, updating, charging them, making sure that because they're not being used all the time, then they have, when they're being pulled out for usage, they're actually working and connected to a nice Wi-Fi setting. Wi-Fi is another thing. You gotta join your IT team if you're using video services and make sure that it's a designated channel for your video interpretations. For spoken languages, doesn't really matter as much, but for ASL, if you're using the same channel or the same network that you use for your guests and everything else, then you're not gonna get a good upload, download. So it's gonna be a choppy image, the interpreter is gonna freeze, half of the communication is gonna get lost. Spoken languages are not as bad because even if the image freezes, you still hear the person. For the most part, it goes through, but it's good to keep that in mind. So training the staff on these policies is important. So have staff meetings, sessions to educate employees about the policies and responsibilities, emphasizing the importance of maintaining confidentiality and adhering to established procedures. Make sure the policies are easy accessible to clients, so you can publish your policies and on the company website and make them readable, available in physical locations such as reception areas, customer service desk. Provide clients with clear instructions on how to access and review these policies. Regularly review and update the policies. Stay up to date on laws, regulations, industry best practices. Periodically review and update your policies to ensure and remain effectiveness and compliance. Now, there is a 1557 rule that came with the ACA, the Affordable Care Act, and it's kind of based on Title VI that we have to provide. If you receive some sort of federal funding, you have to provide some sort of service free of charge, and these have to be communicated. So shortly, I will try to see if I can upload some samples. LEP, and LEP stands for Limited English Proficiency. It's a website called lep.gov. They provide a resource of already translated cards on what is called I Speak cards. So it says I speak English, and it would say yo hablo español, and it says the same phrase in all these other languages. So the person can just point and you know what they speak, and you can get the interpreter over the phone or the right resources that they need in the language. Now, there is the use of, so when we talk about training staff, and we're going to do a whole workshop on training, just to give you a little overview on the training the staff, there is two portions of it. There is the what I just said, training on how to use the equipment, how to use, to have knowledge about the policies and procedures, how to use the language access. And this is for everybody, everybody that works for the organization. Now, for those that are bilingual, there should be two layers. like I mentioned at the beginning, we have to specify what bilingual means and who's bilingual and how we know that they're bilingual. That's one thing. Once we have somebody that is bilingual, the policy would be that they can only, based on their job description, they can only use their language skills within their job description, meaning they don't need to use an interpreter. Exonerates the person from using an interpreter. Now, there is another layer, whether we're using that bilingual person to be the interpreter or the translator, then if that's the way that they were hired, make sure that the organization has some sort of job that's included in the job description, that is they're part of being interpreters and translators, or that it has to go in the job description. Also, if they're bilingual, they should have some sort of training on how to do the interpretation part. And future workshop will provide some of this type of training, which is modes of interpretation. There are 3 different types of interpretation: consecutive, simultaneous, side translation. What do they mean? How do I do it? How am I supposed to, if I'm providing a communication services as an interpreter, but I'm bilingual, I'm a front desk employee, but somebody comes in, I usually use the clinics or medical field as an example, just because I have tons of experience in there. But if I'm a front desk person and the doctor comes in and say, hey, you speak Tagalog, I need you, and I come in, I need to know how I'm going to provide the information, because I'm now the voice of a patient and I'm the voice of a doctor. I'm not my own voice as a front desk person. So I'm stepping out of my scope of practice.
Excuse me,
So
David.
yes.
If you can please just zoom in a little bit on the presentation, as some people cannot see clearly.
Oh. So
125% would be good.
I think it just goes back to original settings. Let's see if I can do this another way. 1 second. Ah.
Hi, David. I'm so sorry. That was my request because I can't see the words. They're so tiny. But maybe if you click on the square in the top right corner of where it's like a blue kind of top screen or whatever. But yeah, I mean, I could, as long as because my face is just a couple inches from the screen. That's why I'm off screen, so I could take notes. And that's okay too.
No,
I think the square next to share, when you put your mouse in the middle, next to share, on the top, yep, on the top right corner, the little square with the corners. Maybe they'll give it like full screen.
Is it better?
Yeah, there we go.
Yes, thank you.
Okay. So where was I? So yeah, so if we're having bilingual staff provide the services, then I would say make sure that there is some sort of training development that is whether it's part of their annual training, and it should be specific terminology on the organization, especially if they provide a type of service as an interpreter outside their scope of practice, then they should have some sort of training based on that. So it would be, maybe my suggestion would be some hours of vocabulary, some hours on specific terminology for your organization. Also, there is something that we call false cognates. Very common in Spanish, Latin languages, some European languages have it too, just because English is formed from all these other languages. So there are words that might sound the same, but they have different meaning. And if the person doesn't know the word, but it's like, oh, this sounds like this other word, and they use it, then that might create an issue. Also, in your policies and procedures should include something about avoiding the use of minors, somebody that is under 18. Now, as we know, we have a lot of families that come in and they might be very limited English proficient, but they have a kid that goes to school, elementary school, age, let's say, put an age, 9 years old, fifth grader, and they they speak well. They speak well both languages, but we have to keep in mind that it's very basic communication. So it is, if the communication that is being provided is very basic, there is no issue of using anybody. But if the communication is not as basic, then that's when you need to use your own resources. A lot of the times, if it's something vital, for example, if it's something legal or medical, then even if the person refuses, it's better to train our staff, our providers, our employees to say, well, that's fine that you don't want to use the interpreter, but the interpreter will be for me. So I could still request an interpreter to stand by to make sure that the communication is accurate, or I can just have my own interpreter provide the communication just because I know that they're well trained. Interpreters, translators, they spend a lot of time in education on how to do it. Some of them are college degrees, some are certificates, but there is a lot of input on there's a lot of education training that is years of training sometimes. And to have somebody to say, oh, we don't need an interpreter because we have the 9-year-old providing the services, that's kind of not acceptable because the 9-year-old doesn't have any training. If we are in a dental office and it says something about gums, that we have a gum abscess, that might be really confusing because the only word for gums that a kid would know would be a chewing gum. And it would basically say, Mom, you need to stop chewing gum. And that will create a lot of confusion and maybe not be compliant with taking antibiotics for abscess in the gums. So terminology is important, education, continuing education, all of those points should be included in a policy. There is a draft policy that I might see if I can put here available in one of the links. While I do that, let me share this video. One second. So this video is based on using somebody that is trained as an interpreter and using technology to provide interpretation.
Intelligence has been threatening everyone's jobs, including interpreters. Inaccurate interpretation can be the difference between a good or bad nuclear deal. So why are tested a speech translator called Kudo versus human interpreters to see which better transmits all of the necessary elements for people to understand what they are hearing, including emotion, intonation, completeness, spontaneity, and speed.
Liars' jobs
To test out if AI is really better than a human. Let's begin. Test 1.
Here we go.
We gave Barry and Kudo a 2020 speech from King Felipe of Spain. The speech is about the COVID crisis. The subjects will focus on emotion.
Because of the pandemic. I parachuted into this not knowing anything about the speech when it was given. In this speech, what matters more is the emotion and the ability to connect with the audience, because he's speaking to the citizens of Spain at a very difficult time when many have suffered loss, are going through a number of challenges. This reminds us of very deep feelings. At this time, many of you are fighting against the illness and what it has done in your homes.
Translator.
Good evening. I address you on this Christmas Eve, when we are living truly exceptional circumstances due to the pandemic.
In terms of content and completeness, the AI did very well.
The virus has broken into our lives, bringing suffering, sadness, or fear, altered our way of life.
It struggled with word choice in a number of areas. It referred to an overflow in some hospitals.
And also overflow in some of our hospitals.
Now, what that was referring to is at that time when hospitals were overwhelmed, when the king was recognizing the healthcare workers for the work that they had done. And he recognized the tremendous physical and emotional burden that they were carrying. And the AI translated that as the great emotional charge and physics on their backs. If you know Spanish, you can go back and figure out how it is that the AI determined to use those words, but obviously that is borderline nonsensical. If you look at what the speech-to-speech translation produced, it was by and large quite accurate. However, it's very difficult to get the sense of what the king is seeking to portray through the AI in its current state.
Test 2, spontaneity. We gave Walter and Kudo a 2021 speech from former Senator and now current Colombian President, Gustavo Petro.
The most powerful and unproductive sectors of this country, 20 billion pesos a year. So I took the hour beforehand to look him up, look at some of his videos, just listen to the level of language he employs, listen to his rhythms, listen to, watch his body language.
Now let's see how the speech translator did.
You are, Mr. President in office.
Presidente en ejercicio. En el año de 2019 este Congreso decidió regalarle a
In the
los
year of
sectores
2019, this Congress decided to give to the most powerful and unproductive sectors of the country 20 billion pesos a year.
The particular strength of artificial intelligence was in capturing those terms of art. Artificial intelligence captured president in office or sitting president, presidente en funciones, minister of finance, ministro de Hacienda, special drawing rights. That's a consecrated term. It's a term that's enshrined that you can find in any number of glossaries. That's the official translation. And I miss that. Official caucuses as well, that the artificial translation rendered that very clearly, and it pulls those in and did so very well. That's what I felt it was most effective at. And where I felt it had the most shortcomings was because of the pauses.
When El País has a stagnant economy and an impoverished middle class, what this tax reform brings.
y después
It is to increase taxes on the productive company, small and medium fundamentally.
absolutamente agresiva como emitir
An
dinero para regalar.
absolute contradiction and absurdity.
The artificial intelligence creates these little islands, these little bubbles that read like complete thoughts but are not, because there's a flow. There's a flow that's coming after the pause. And thanks to an absolutely aggressive social policy, making a gift to the bankers.
And thanks to an absolutely aggressive social policy, how to issue money to give to bankers.
So the pauses in this particular speech seem to throw the artificial intelligence off. You have the vocal inflection, increasing taxes on those who govern Colombia, that, allows you to understand there's something else coming, I'm not finished yet. Unproductive capital, those who don't work, but prey on the state, on the people, and on nature. Thank you, sir.
Task 3. We gave Barry and Kudo a 2021 speech from El Salvadorian President Nayib Bukele. The speech is highly crafted, prepared, and read from a teleprompter at a high rate of speed.
We are going to make use of Bandesal. I will tell you that it was a very challenging experience for me as a professional interpreter to interpret that speech accurately and completely. What you have to
Well, I'm stopping right there. So what I want to bring in with this type of comparison about AI and interpreting services is that depending on what your organization provides the communication on, if it's not vital, if it's something simple, there are some AI, ChatGPT, Cubo, well, there's tons of AI platforms nowadays that they can provide some sort of translation about the message that you're trying to provide. But my recommendation is always to use it as a tool. Have somebody that is a translator for the language or speaks that language to make sure that they can assess it, they can make the corrections, and if that's a cost-effective way that your organization is trying to go. That's the problem that we've had in the past in multiple organizations with Google Translate. Google Translate is a good tool. You can use it. You don't remember how to say something, you look it up. It'll give you that information. But something as simple that I've seen in some organizations, such as a holiday, we're going to be closed because of this holiday. It was a total disaster because the name of the holiday, it was not translated well, it was translated too literal, and then it just didn't make sense about we're gonna be off because of the holidays. So the person that used it as a tool didn't speak the language, so that's why they couldn't realize that it was well written or not. So if you're using some sort of AI translation platform, make sure that you have somebody to review it and make sure that it kind of makes sense. Don't forget to start typing your questions. I'm trying to see. So, okay, translations. We have pros, cons, the software, this type of platforms of AI. Yeah, they might increase efficiency. They might be cost effective, especially I'm going to use my ChatGPT, Google Translate, or this other platform to translate this document because I don't have to pay somebody to do it. It's going to be cost effective, but it might be inaccurate, the translation, especially if what you're trying to portray is very technical, or the wording might have multiple meanings. We have some of the organizations that I've worked with that they have very particular terminology, so that has to be considered and have somebody on staff or have somebody that actually can handle that type of terminology and make sure that it's being used as a tool and not as the only source for translation. Consistency, yeah, it might provide consistency, but it might be limited on the languages as well. Now, interpretation services over the phone, video, on-site, bilingual staff, or contracted with somebody that can just bring somebody on site, those are always available, are best practices. If you're using over the phone, just make sure that there is quality audio, that everybody knows what the 1-800 number is, provide necessary information to the interpreter, because when it comes to billing services, when I get a bill for a big call, I want to make sure that it was somebody from my staff and not that, I don't know, the 1-800 got shared with another organization or somebody's misusing the service. So there's gotta be some sort of codes, something in place to use with video over telephone. And for video, like I said, make sure that you have a good display, good camera, good microphone, good connectivity. And if it's on-site interpretation, then make sure that it's scheduled in advance, provide necessary materials and resources. If you're having somebody to provide something in person, it's always good to, in the interpreting world, we call it pre-session. I'm not going to go in and help you communicate with somebody not knowing the type of terminology that I'm going to encounter. So ahead of time, I'll ask you, what is this about? And then based on what you tell me, then I'll be more prepared on looking up for some of the terminology. And the goal of somebody that's providing communication is to make the speakers sound the best. So like I said, there are some platforms, language apps, softwares, but make sure that you use it as a tool, have somebody to review them and make sure that it's accurate. Now, I'm gonna go on the questions, but something that I want you to keep in mind, and this is in the words of Nelson Mandela, he said, if you talk to a man in a language he understands, that goes to his head. If you talk to him in his own language, his mother language, native language, that goes to his heart. So that's one of the reasons why we usually provide also the service, to make sure that the person is welcome, is included. And I'm gonna go to your questions.
We do have a question on the chat. Elsie is asking, what are useful translation services?
What are useful translation services? So I find it like a broad question. So the recommendation is over the phone. Video services are usually on demand. You don't have to pay for them unless you're using them. And it's usually a per minute cost. So if your organization already has a vendor, then the idea is to train everybody on how to use the vendor, how to use the number to communicate. The idea of providing the I Speak cards, which I'm gonna see how I can upload them here, is for somebody to point and say, oh, I speak this, and then you can get somebody over the phone and see what they need to communicate. Usually this type of communications, like on the front with the front desk, and what they need might take 2 minutes, 1 minute. So it could be, less than a couple of bucks. So it's better to have that in place. It's cost effective. Usually when you encounter a lot of clients, customers that come in a specific language, a lot of organizations get a lot of Spanish speakers, Mandarin, Tagalog. So if you get those a lot weekly basis, then you need to start considering hiring bilingual staff. Or if you already have the bilingual staff, then make sure that there is some sort of training on them on also how to do the process on communication. Translation, written documents, brochures, flyers, websites. That's also part of the language access. I would say, the purpose of what you're doing or how you're doing it, if there's a specific form, there are ways to translate them in a way that it might be yes or no questions, and then you don't need to have those translated back. But if it's something like open-ending, and you're asking the person, please tell us what issues you're experiencing, then that's very open-ending. You're gonna need a translator to put that language into English to find out what they're asking or what they're saying. Am I answering your question, or do you have any specifics on the specific question?
I'll go ahead and add something to that, David. So currently, for those of you that don't know, in the current language access project that we are doing here in United Way, we are offering 3 different services. We have the over the phone translation, and that is as simple as dialing a phone number, getting a translator over the phone, and then have a 3-way communication. You can either do that through your cell phone, your office phone, or even through an app, and that is through Propio. We also do document translation, and then we also do interpretation for American Sign Language and other sign languages as well. We also request us to see if we can get Spanish Sign Language, or basically any sign language we are looking for. So I'm gonna go ahead and share 2 phone numbers that any of you can use to get an over-the-phone translator. And these phone numbers are specifically for government agencies and nonprofits. So you can only use these phone numbers if you work for a government agency and you're assisting somebody and you need a translator, or same if you work for a nonprofit and you're assisting someone and you need translator. They cover over 300 languages. In our current project, we're covering 9 languages, but we give you the freedom to pick any language you need help with. So I'm gonna go ahead and put the phone numbers on the chat box for other government agencies and also for nonprofits. And it's as simple as dialing the phone number, pressing 1 for Spanish, or 8 or 2 for other languages. And then you can say the language, and then you're gonna get connected with somebody who's speaking that language. Does anyone have any questions about that?
And I just wanted to follow up on that too. So equipment on using those languages. So if you're using over the phone, my recommendation has been, there are 2 ways to utilize the system, because it's horrible to have the phone and be like, this is what I need to do, or I want you to go to see the doctor, and then pass it back and forth. So having a cordless phone that has a speaker is beneficial for you to use that type of service, because then everybody can hear and there is proper communication. The interpreter doesn't have to wait for each person to do it. Always remember to speak in first person, not interpreter tell her this. You have to say, just like they're understanding you, just say in English in first person. And there is, if it's something private and you need a dual set phone, there is something that I usually recommend, and I'm gonna see if I can share this picture. 1 second. It's called a phone splitter. Basically, you can add a secondary. 1 second, I'm having it open. Here we go. Okay, so these are phone splitters. Usually on one of these holes, you put in your headset or your handheld phone, and you can label, that way you can have 2, one that actually hangs up, and the other one will be just available. That way it's more of a, they're very affordable. They're about $1, but usually you can just use 2 of these telephones, handhelds, and one for you, one for the person that needs it. And if the communication has to be private, you don't want anybody else to hear, that's a good way to keep it private.
And thank you, David. Just to answer Elsie's question, Yeah, so we would send out an email and eventually the phone numbers would not be available. But I'm pretty positive that the phone numbers are gonna be available for quite some time. And our long-term goal is to make this service for as available as for the long run.
And here in the chat box, I'm attaching a PDF format, which is what I told you about the iSpeak booklet. It's got in every single language, the iSpeak, just so you can have that available, an idea on something that you have to have in display when using a telephone.
All right, just to be respectful of everyone's time, it is 12:05 p.m. So for those of you that need to leave the meeting, please go ahead. For any of you that want to stay and ask any questions, please go ahead and do so. David, is there anything you would like to add?
No, just if there are any questions, comments, feel free to send them to Abel. He will get a hold of me. Or if you have a direct contact array with me, don't hesitate to reach out. I'm always available to answer any questions.